And now on Book TV, we want to introduce you to UCLA professor Otto Santa Ana. Professor Santa Ana, what do you teach here at UCLA?
I'm in the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies.
And so what courses are you teaching?
Well, I teach courses in language in the media, language in the classroom. I teach a course on political humor. I teach courses on language in all aspects of language that are socially relevant.
Well, your book that we want to talk to you about here on Book TV is Juan in 100, the representation of Latinos on network news. Here's the cover of the book, but Professor, before we get started, I want to ask you, what does the word Latino mean?
Latino is all the people who are of Latin American origin, who are now citizens of the United States.
And you're a professor of Chicano Studies. What does Chicano mean?
Chicana and Chicano means Mexican-American descent. So it's another way of saying it is Mexican-Americans.
What's the Latino population in the United States today?
Wow, that's about 52 million people.
So a sixth of the country.
A huge portion of our society.
And your book is about their representation on network news. Sixth of U.S. society. How many stories on the network news are about Latinas, Latinos?
Sadly, less than 1% of all the news stories on the evening news on the networks have to do with Latinos.
Why?
Why? I think it's because Latinos are not considered by the media to be part of the social fabric of the United States. I looked at 12,000 news stories, one full year of network news for ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC. And in that year, I counted all the news stories of the evening news. That's 365 days, 7 days a week. There were over 12,000 stories. Between 98 and 115 were about Latinos. So that constitutes about, less than 1%. And so that's why I call it Juan in 100.
And when you say it's a Latino story or about a Latino, what does that mean?
It was everything from stories about immigration, stories about I chose 1994 to look at. And so we looked at the presidential elections campaign of the time. We looked at stories about Cuban Americans, about Dominican Americans, Dominicans. We looked at all the stories possible. It even included Salvadorian, let's see if I can get this right. This had to do with how baseballs were stitched in San Salvador. I mean, I tried to be as inclusive as possible, and we ended up having a very, very narrow focus, very, very narrow scope. So we really do not characterize Latinos, the network news does not characterize Latinos adequately.
When they were portrayed, how were they portrayed?
Frankly, they were presented in a very skewed manner. There were very good stories, don't get me wrong, but there were a lot of stories that indicated a relatively impoverished understanding of what Latinos are. And then there was skewing that was built on stereotyping, expectations that were not met. And I looked frame by frame at each of about 48 news stories, and to make sure that I could understand what was being articulated. I compared that to the story of the day by looking at news stories across in the printed media as well. And so I could see what exactly was being spoken about on the news and how well the network news covered the story of the day.
And when you put it in the larger context, what did you find?
We found that Latinos are, as I said, not understood to be part of that 1/6 of our population is not really understood to be very, very pertinent to the American community.
I want to read a little bit from your book, Juan in 100. Alberto Gonzales nominated Attorney General in the 6-scene, 26-shot ABC story on Gonzales. Peter Jennings, in a standard anchor shot, announces Bush's nominee for Attorney General. President Bush made some history today. He nominated a Hispanic Texan to be Attorney General. Is there anything wrong with how he started back in 2000?
That one you've caught me off guard. I'm not quite sure if I recall what the issue was there.
Okay. I'll read a little bit more, but you tell me what you hear here. His confirmation is almost certain, though there will be some questions. Scene 2 frames the Gonzales nomination as an affirmative action appointment, alternating shots of the president and Gonzales.
This was the Attorney General who was confirmed, served as well as he could, and he was represented as an affirmative action candidate. He was all his background. He had served. He had an incredible curriculum vitae. He had been Supreme Court Justice in Texas. He had served admirably, and the framing of the network news cast him as simply filling in a slot. The affirmative action, the Hispanic who was being characterized. None of his achievements were characterized, only the fact that Bush had chosen this Hispanic to fill his slot.
In your view, Professor, how could that have been framed differently?
You could have mentioned that he was Hispanic and then talked about his credentials. You could have spoken about how what his philosophy was. There would have been a greater sense of the integration of that candidate, that appointee, into the American government. But no, it was simply this two-dimensional image, Hispanic, he's filling an affirmative action position, and nothing about his background was discussed in the initial framing.
You go on to say that when Gonzales is seen in this news story making remarks, ABC reinforces its framing by choosing images that present him echoing his president's characterization, and that he grew up poor, and that was an important part of the story as well.
Well, that was an important part of the story. That was, I think, quite useful. But there was nothing about what the man had done before he had arrived on the scene, on the national scene. It is very appropriate to talk about the American dream. I think that's an important aspect that should be covered in American network news. But more about the individual, more about the reasons that Bush had chosen him. Not strictly his politics, but also the character behind him. To give you an example, it's typical to have an obituary, a famous person who's passed away each day in the network news. That was the year that Ronald Reagan passed away. There were 200 news stories about his obituary. How many Latinos were represented as an obituary of someone of note? Absolutely zero. Not one person. And we had federal court judges, we had people who had been pioneers in art, in politics, in the sciences, and not one of those individuals characterized in the network news. That is the blinding, the erasure of 1/6 of our population.
Gabriel Garcia Marquez recently passed away, seemed to get heavy coverage.
That was a wonderful thing, and he's Colombian. He is not a U.S. Latino. So certainly when Octavio Paz passed away, tremendous coverage. That's a Latin American. But when, when in 1994, Gloria Anzaldúa passed away. Gloria Anzaldúa was considered by had written one of the 100 most important books of the 20th century. She was not characterized. She is a theorist, a poet. She talked about the borderlands in an incredible way. There's a whole literature now that follows her academically and poetically, and she was not given any mention. Tato Taviera, a famous Puerto Rican poet,